Welcome to the Note Investor Podcast. We'll guide you through the ups and downs of note investing and teach you all about the nitty-gritty details of the business that other people won't talk about. Your host, Dan Deppen, is a former aerospace engineer and product manager who transitioned away from cubicle life to full-time note investing in 2018. Our website is www.fusionnotes.com, where you can subscribe to this podcast, comment, and find links to other information on note investing.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Note Investor Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Deppen, and this week I've got a case study on a deal in a non-performing note that turned into a seller finance deal. So this is one that's had a lot of twists and turns. It's actually not all the way over yet, but I think you'll find it pretty interesting. There were a lot of things that came up as this one went along, and a lot of things that I learned along the way I think you'll like. But before I get into that, I think it'd probably be good to talk about the state of the note market. So as I record this today, where are we at? June 7th, because as we know, there's a lot of craziness going on in the world, and the market's kind of been in flux, so it's something I'm trying to follow as we go along. I am seeing more assets go on sale, so the number of notes up for sale has definitely increased, seeing a lot more tapes over the last couple weeks. In some cases the pricing hasn't necessarily adjusted that much, but in other cases it has, depending. So lots more available. There was some good economic news over the last week. The unemployment rate came out and was a lot lower than expected. And there were a few other things. I get an email from the Wall Street Journal every morning that I go through. So some of the recent news was surprisingly good. I kind of take all that with a little bit of a grain of salt, just because we're obviously not out of the woods yet economically. And while a lot of things are reopening, Las Vegas is open now. A lot of cities are reopening to various degrees. They're actually going to have spectators at a PGA Tour event in a couple weeks. There's kind of a long ways to go, but the news was better than I would have expected given everywhere we've been. So that's a positive sign, but like I said, take it with sort of a grain of salt. Last week I did do a webinar where I went a little more in depth on this. I didn't turn that into a podcast, but if you're interested in checking that out, you can find that on the YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube/Fusion Notes, you can find that. And one of the things I talked about on the webinars, where my focus has been in this environment, has been on performing notes, and kind of specifically contract for deeds, which has become a little bit of a specialty for me, but ones that are have good performance histories and then equity with them as well, because I think that provides a decent margin of safety right now. So basically, if you look at a note that has a pretty good performance history, if it's a year plus, and I've seen a bunch lately that are like 3-4 years of performing, even if the borrower has a job loss due to COVID, which right now pretty much any borrower could have a job loss due to COVID, more than likely they will get that figured out or straightened out. You might miss a few months of payments, but if they've been paying that long, they're probably not just going to let it go. And then if there's equity there as well, it does two things. It's given the borrower an extra incentive to get it back on track so they don't lose any of that equity. And then also it gives you, the note buyer, a margin of safety, because if a loan performing note does go completely bad and you have to foreclose, then that gives you room to make yourself whole. And the other thing that I've been doing increasingly, I've got a couple of these in work, is converting these contract for deeds or land contracts over to mortgages. For many note investors, mortgages are more desirable. You can generally sell those for a bigger premium, and all the borrowers I've reached out to and asked about this have really jumped at the opportunity. Also gets you off title, which can be nice if the code enforcement people come knocking, or you run into water bills or other sorts of things. That might be a good deep dive for a future podcast. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole though. Right now, I am in the middle of completing an acquisition. It's my first acquisition in a couple months. I had been kind of laying low there for a while, but now I've started to put out some bids and picking some new ones up, which is great. And I'm seeing, I mentioned I was seeing more assets. I'm starting to see some large pools of contract for deeds at some really attractive prices. And so I'm not quite ready to pull the trigger on one of those just yet, but I think coming up here over the next few months, there are going to be some really great opportunities to take down pools, which I would probably do within the 10% fund. So if you're an accredited investor and something like the 10% fund is something of interest, you can go to fusionnotes.com or just drop me an email at dan@fusionnotes.com and I can get you more information on that. But I think there would be some really good opportunities coming up over the next few months out to a year or so on that. So that's the state of the market for now. But sorry, I goofed up my slides here if you're watching on YouTube. But getting back to our seller finance case study. So this was a duplex in Ohio, and I'm not giving out all the address information and all of that because I still have the seller finance note on this, and I don't want any yahoos pestering my borrower or anything like that. But this was a non-performing contract for deed that I bought in August of 2019. Unpaid balance was a little over $44,000. I paid just under $16,500 for it, but there were over $4,000 in delinquent taxes, so my net price was around $20,000 overall. The seller had a BPO of $85,000. My BPO came back at $86,000 for the 30-day quick sale price, so there's quite a bit of equity there. And the status, I said it was non-performing, so it was 13 months behind, but the borrower had made 8 out of 12 payments and had paid in the most recent month. And this is really the kind of loan that's right in my wheelhouse. I have a really good track record of getting loans like this where they're behind, but they're making a fair number of payments. I can usually get those borrowers flipped around, work out some kind of a deal, turn it into a performing loan, season it, and then resell it. This one obviously didn't go that way, which we'll get into. But I always like when I do these case studies is I always save the data on my ROI estimates up front, so I can always kind of compare that to what actually happened, and I'm continuously adjusting my financial model. And there's some things in here I'll point out that I would have treated differently had I been doing this today. So my actual purchase price of $16,480 was 37% of the unpaid balance, but there were $4,200 in delinquent taxes, and so I really paid 47% of unpaid balance, which, I was still pretty happy with for a note that looked like it had a lot of equity and had a lot of payments in the last 12 months. So bought this in August of 2019, and at the time of purchase, if I was estimating if I was able to get this modified and reperforming and then sell it at 70% of the UPB, I would actually end up with a whopping 60% ROI, which would be 30% to the joint venture partner after the split. And if I had to foreclose, and I'll back up a second. So this was a contract for deed, is in Ohio. I've talked about this before, but Ohio has some special rules on contract for deeds. If the borrower's made a certain number of payments or under certain conditions, you have to go through a foreclosure instead of a judicial foreclosure, instead of being able to do the forfeiture. And this is one I would have had to foreclose on. So I estimated my expenses in that case, worst case, of about $14,000. That would have about $5,000-$6,000 for the foreclosure, a couple $1,000 to do a clean out. I seem to always get stuck with expensive clean outs. And then servicing and the delinquent taxes of the $4,000 and some other things. I was assuming I would sell it for $75,000 and net about $67,000. So I took my $86,000 30-day quick sale BPO, knocked it down by about 13%. that's one where today I would have knocked that down by a lot more. So if you listen to the last podcast episode, if you haven't, I really suggest listening to that one. I talked about how I went through my data of my REOs and comparing the price that I sold them for to my BPO price going into the deal. Those are averaging around 60%. And since then, I made some posts on some of the various note investing Facebook groups to ask other people what they were seeing, and a lot of other experienced investors have seen a similar type of phenomenon. So that estimate was high. But using that high estimate, I was still coming up with 56% ROI or 28% to the JV partner. So that was my estimate going in. That was obviously off. So then we started the loss mitigation. So completed the closing on the note, got it transferred over. I used Polaris counselors for the borrower outreach. Polaris is actually no longer in business, but they were a nonprofit credit counselor that I really used to like to use for borrower outreach. They moved on to another completely unrelated startup, so can't use them anymore. But we were able to get a forbearance agreement in place with the borrower. Now, the borrower had a forbearance agreement with the seller of the note, which they didn't follow through on. But Polaris talked to them. We worked some things out. We put another one in place with the understanding that, okay, if you don't follow through on this, we're going to foreclose right away. Lo and behold, the borrower made one payment and then didn't follow through on the agreement. And them not following on the agreement is not a huge shock because they had not done that before. And this forbearance agreement did not have a good faith down payment part of the component, which I always recommend and is a good thing to do, but the borrower just couldn't get the borrower to agree to it. So basically decided, we'll put this agreement in place with a certain number of payments. If they follow through, great. If not, we're foreclosing anyways. And did get one payment out of them, but then they stopped paying again. And the borrower ultimately ended up agreeing to do cash for keys. And this borrower is really a tough person to understand. I ultimately ended up speaking with him a number of times. He was always very friendly with me on the phone, but Polaris had said they would have one conversation and be very friendly, and the next conversation they'd be getting upset and dropping F-bombs all over the place. I never had him get upset with me on the phone. He was always very nice on the phone, but I did have times where I would talk to him on the phone, and then later in the day he'd be sending me text messages with explicatives. His girlfriend, who Polaris had talked to, and actually I had talked to her as well later on, had mentioned that he, quote, in the past had problems with drugs, had been in jail for drugs, and so I don't know what was going on with his brain chemistry. Like I said, every time I spoke with him, he was a nice enough guy, but, definitely kind of off, kind of all over the map, hard to follow. And I found this with other borrowers as well, where it's not that they are, sometimes they're a challenge, not that they're being combative, not that they're being disagreeable, but you just can't keep them on a topic. You're talking about one thing and then they're over here and then they're over there, and you can never quite get them pinned down. But they did ultimately agree to a cash for keys deal. So in the cash for keys agreement, so the way this was structured, so we agreed to a $2,500 cash for keys. Normally I wouldn't go that high, but there's a lot of equity in the property. And he said he needed money for moving expenses, so generally that's higher. I mean, a lot of times I'll start cash for keys offers at like $500, but in this case I went higher because of the equity in the property, and I just wanted to get them out. And when you're evaluating these deals, right, you always kind of want to look at your next best alternative. So while $2,500 is more than I would normally like to do, it's a heck of a lot better than spending $5,000 or $6,000 on a foreclosure that's going to take maybe 6 to 9 months. And then I might have to do an eviction after that. So if he takes this, that's actually pretty darn good. And the way this was structured, and pay attention to this because I think it's very important, I set up the cash for keys in 2 steps. So I set it up to where he would get $1,000 for signing the cancellation of land contract and the agreement and the surrender of possession, which is basically the agreement to move out. So there are actually two documents: the cancellation of land contract and the surrender of possession. And then $1,500 later, when he actually leaves the property and has it cleaned out. So there are a lot of things I'm trying to accomplish here. For the $1,000, once he signs the cancellation of land contract, that land contract is dead. That means I don't have to foreclose and spend the $5,000 or $6,000. So even if I give him the $1,000 and he signs the papers, and he then doesn't move out and holds up, I don't have to go through the foreclosure. I still might have to do an eviction, but that's not nearly as big a deal as having to do that. So getting that cancellation of land contract is like gold, because once he gets that, he can get squirrely, and I'm in a much better position. The other thing I'm doing is making the cash contingent on having it cleaned out and broom swept. And that means I don't have to pay for a clean out. So when I have evicted borrowers or had borrowers just bail, I've often ended up with some very expensive clean outs. They can cost several $1,000s. So by paying this $2,500, the alternative could be $5,000 to $6,000 in legal fees, plus $2,000 to $5,000 even for clean out, depending on how big of a pig he is and what's left inside. So it's a pretty good deal for me, especially for that $1,000. I've got the cancellation of land contract. Now I'm in a really good position. So what ended up happening was he didn't leave on time. It took him a couple weeks longer to get out than what he said. And then he did it his former girlfriend, who was still living in the one unit. So I kind of mentioned in passing, this was a duplex. This is one of the things I liked about the deal. He was actually renting out there's an upstairs unit, a downstairs unit. He was renting out the upstairs unit, which I didn't realize until later in the deal, and he was rent skimming, which begs the question of, if you're collecting $450 in rent from the people upstairs, why can't you make a sub $400 payment on the mortgage? He couldn't. Hard to explain, but that's what was going on. But anyways, his former girlfriend stayed in the downstairs unit, so even after he was gone, I had to kind of coax her out. Now, I didn't pay him the second part of the money because she was still there. And he was actually helping me try to get her out. At one point, he had the power turned off to that unit. She was able to call the power company and get the power turned back on. And she eventually left, and I had conversations with her too. She said she was working on finding another place and it wasn't ready, and things drug on. We finally got her out there. I should have looked up the dates. I think it was, by the time everybody was out, I think it was 6 to 8 weeks after what was originally agreed to. However, it was cleaned out, which was good and was in reasonable condition. Now, there was also a water bill. So one of the big things on contract for deeds, because you're on title in certain areas, if you're on title, they want the water bill in your name. And if the borrower is not performing on the loan, as you know, they're typically not paying the taxes and insurance either, and they're often not paying the utilities. So there ended up being this large water bill. It was over $1,000. I forget, the exact total might have been like $1,200 until it was all said and done. So I had the conversation with the borrower. Hey, I know I owe you $1,500, but at the time when we had the discussion, it was like $800 something owed for the water. So I need to net that out. And he kind of went, oh, lately. It was kind of acted like he was caught, because he knew this water bill was there, and I think he thought I knew it wasn't there. So I ended up paying him $620 for the second installment instead of the $1,500, but I did have all these water bills later. And it was interesting too, because at first he was fine with this. Later on he wasn't. That led to some of his explicative laden texts, but that's where we ended up. He was definitely kind of a volatile character, but I was happy with how all this worked out in the end. Again, I think the big thing when you're negotiating these and working with these borrowers, I've told some people about this and they get appalled and they're like, well, why did you pay him a penny? Because he broke the deal. He was supposed to be out by this date and then he wasn't. But I think the key is always, to look at your alternatives. I mean, one is if I have to evict them, that's not, that's time consuming and costs money as well. Plus, you don't know that he's going to leave it in good condition like he would need to get the money. He could leave junk. He could cause damage. You don't know. At one point when this was going on, my former assistant was suggesting taking a much harder line with him. And the guy from Polaris said, look, this guy, he's a drug problem. He's volatile, right? He's nice and cooperative one second and flying off the handle the next. He said he's liable to burn the place to the ground. It's like you just want to get him the heck out of there. So that was the deal. So as you're doing these note deals, assess these things not in terms of what's quote unquote right, but are you making the best decision based on your alternatives available? Don't get hung up on the principle of, well, this guy didn't follow the letter of the deal, so I'm going to stick it to him, because that could end up costing you money. So it's a very important point that sometimes people who are new to the game, I think, don't quite take to heart. I mean, overall, I was very pleased with how this turned out. Okay, so the rental agreement. So sorry, for watching this on YouTube, my PowerPoint is kind of goofing up. I may make some adjustments here. Yeah, we'll do it like that. So the rental agreement. So I mentioned there were renters upstairs. He was rent skimming. I got in touch with them, and the borrower was actually able to give me the original lease that they signed. So these borrowers had been there since 2016, so about 4 years by the time we were doing all of this. It was a family from Nepal. They had like 6 people in the place, and they had been paying reliably for those 4 years. So I created a new lease. I wanted to keep them there because there was really no benefit to kicking them out. I could be stuck with another clean out. They're going to have to find somewhere else to go, and they're paying rent. I mean, that's really a nice bonus when you have to take a property back and you find a renter there. So they had been paying the former borrower $475 a month. I increased that to $550, but agreed to make some repairs as well. Ended up doing $700 on repairs. It was actually like a broken window, some things in the toilet. Because this borrower, he was collecting rent and he wasn't doing anything up there. He was really not treating them well, but I think, I don't know a lot of the background on these folks, but I think sometimes, folks who are kind of immigrants, they sort of put up with a lot and take what they can get. So he had really been, the borrower had been really sort of abusive towards them. So I made some of those repairs that were critical. By the time I ended up selling the property, I collected 3 months in rent. So that was terrific. I ended up not charging them a security deposit because the borrower stole their deposit. And that's another one where I should have, if you have a new rental agreement, you're supposed to collect a deposit. But, these borrowers had been there for 4 years. They had been reliable up to that point, communicated really well. Well, only the wife really spoke good English, so I spoke to her. I had a realtor in that area who was really good in helping out with this. He went there, talked to them, put her on speaker, and we negotiated this lease over the phone and got it in place. So, and ultimately collecting a few months in rental income, which was actually more than what the original land contract was paying, was really super nice. But then once I did get that in place, I needed a property manager. So the realtor that I used was actually kind of from another area, a ways away. And I really had a hard time finding a property manager, and I'm not entirely sure why. Some of it is the neighborhood was maybe not the best. I mean, it wasn't a ghetto or anything like that, but, some of the property management companies either didn't cover that area or They only covered units that had higher amounts of rent. They wanted the rent to be like $800, $900, $1,000 a month, not the $550 that I was charging. But I did ultimately find one, and they were able to get the locks changed to get the property secured after got everybody out of the downstairs unit. And they did send me some really nice walkthrough videos. There were 2 videos, like one was like 10 minutes and one was 15 minutes, going through everything. So I had a really good understanding of the condition. But overall, this property manager was a really bad communicator. You'd email her, and it might be a couple days till you hear back. She usually wouldn't pick up the phone, and she would get back to me eventually, but it would be a long time. And so that whole process of getting this done was slower and rougher than it should have been. And to me, when vendors, I realize vendors have a lot going on. They're not going to like respond to an email instantaneously, but when the communication is just poor and you have to repeat things, and things that should take like a day or so end up dragging out over a week, it's a really bad sign. So I didn't have a lot of faith in this particular property manager, but I wasn't super worried about it because my intent was just to get the rental agreement in place with the renters who are already there and then get the property sold. They did give me their estimate of some of the repairs needed. There were a lot of repairs needed to the property. There was a lot of deferred maintenance. There were some potential roof issues. There was, the siding was real bad. Basically, it just hadn't really been maintained at all. And they estimated about $30,000 to address everything and really fix it up. And that, from what I saw from my, I'm not a professional rehabber, but that estimate seemed like it made sense. Like it needed about $30,000 in repair, which I was not interested in doing myself because I just wanted to, get it sold to someone else who would take that on. Especially in this area, I didn't have other vendors. Now, if this was an area where I had really good vendors on the ground and I had a partner who was really interested in putting more money into it, then maybe I could have considered it, but not in this case. I just wanted to do the essentials that the renters upstairs needed. So now selling the property. So in Ohio, property managers also have to be licensed realtors. So in theory, this property manager could have been my realtor, but I didn't really want to use her because the whole way through it wasn't inspiring a ton of confidence. But I did ask her for an estimate of the sale price, and she came back and said, probably somewhere in the 20s, which that really left me scratching my head because my BPO was 86. I realize it needs work, but below 30 doesn't really make any sense to me. Plus, it's already cash flowing $550 a month. So, I mean, I know a lot of people who are buying rentals use the 1% rule where they like the rent to be like 1% of the purchase price. This would be like bordering on the 2% rule. And it's already rented, which doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. And like I said, I didn't have a lot of faith in her. I always worry in some of these cases too, especially if you're selling like to a cash buyer, which is what that sale price would be for, is that, if they come along and say, hey, here's a buyer, they'll pay you whatever, $28,000 cash. I don't really know that it's not a buddy of theirs or, somewhere else where they have another connection and they're just artificially setting it low so they can get a deal. I try not to be too much of a conspiracy theorist in general. I'm not too worried about that. But I was a little concerned about it in this case because the property manager had been so unreliable up to then. And the story she was telling me just didn't make sense compared to everything else. So I used to play a lot of poker back in the day, right? And when you're trying to figure out if someone's bluffing or not, you look at how the hand is developed and the overall story, and does the story add up? Does everything make sense? If there are things in the story that don't make sense and don't add up, then that means there's more of a probability that they might be bluffing. So I wasn't just going to roll with that price, because if I sold this in the 20s, especially with the commissions and the closing costs and everything, I was going to end up upside down on this deal, and I wasn't about to accept going upside down when collecting $550 a month in rent. That just doesn't make any sense. So, but when I was thinking about it though, I mean, I could see where some cash buyers could get into that territory. So, a lot of them, if they're going to buy to do a fix and flip, they'll use sort of standard formula of 70% of ARV minus expenses. So if I took my 86K BPO value as the ARV, which kind of synced a little bit with what Zillow and some other online things were showing. So if you took that and said there were 30K in expenses, and you said, okay, 70% times 86,000 minus 30,000, that equals 30,200. So yeah, if I was going to sell this to a cash buyer, I might actually get 30. Now I would assume if it's already bringing in rents, that would have to factor, but maybe that's where she was getting her numbers from. I'm not sure. But I didn't want to do that. That was not a good option. So what I did was I just listed it on Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace. And I offered it at $50,000 because I was figuring, okay, if the ARV is really in the 80s and it needs 30K in work, 50 kind of makes sense, especially if I'm offering the seller finance and I'm carrying the note, right? That becomes kind of a reasonable deal. So what I offered was $50,000 sale price with $5,000 down. I'll carry a mortgage for $45,000 at an 8% rate for 120 months. And the P&I ends up being just under $546. So the reason I structured it this way was when I talked to First National Acceptance Corporation, which is a company that buys a lot of notes, I had a discussion with them around what's the best way to structure notes to maximize your resale value. And they told me they like kind of a 10-10-10 rule. So 10% down, financed over 10 years, 10% interest rate. So I did 10% down, 10 years. I didn't want to do the 10% interest rate because I know some areas consider that kind of usury. So I moved it to 8%. And that landed me on a payment that was about $545, which is right about exactly what it was already cash flowing in rent. And I did stipulate that the buyer would cover closing costs. So I didn't want to add on costs to that. And when I advertised it on Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace, I advertised it as a house hacking opportunity because you can basically, it's a duplex. It's kind of perfect if you want to follow the bigger pockets house hacking template. Someone can move into the downstairs, which it needed work, but it was definitely livable. I mean, people have been living in there up to then, and it didn't look too bad. So they can live in there, collect rent from the upstairs people, fix it up over time, live. You're not going to live entirely rent-free because you are going to have taxes, insurance, expenses, and other things. But you get pretty darn close. You can fix it up over time and do really, really well. And then I also included in the ad line owner financing available for a deserving buyer with a large down payment. That was something I got from Bob Repass, former guest on the podcast. And I got a really big response. So I ended up finding a buyer pretty quickly for the full asking price. And as things were going on over the next few weeks as we were getting this deal closed, almost every day I left the ads up just in case the deal fell through for any reason. And almost every day I would get pinged by new people. Is this available? Is this available? I'm really interested. So this has me itching to sell more REOs as seller finance. And I should mention too that a lot of this structure was kind of inspired by the conversation I had with Tracy Rui, who was a guest on the podcast a little while back. I don't recall the exact episode number where she does a lot of this, but if you go back and listen to the episode with Tracy Rui, did a lot of talking about seller finance and how to put these together. One lesson learned that jumped out at this was in some counties, and I had run into this one other time before in Indiana, in some counties, you might pay your property tax, say the property taxes you actually pay in 2020, you're actually paying them to cover the year previously. So you pay a tax bill in 2020 that's technically for the 2019 taxes. So what happens is when you sell the property, they want you to get the taxes all the way trued up. So there was actually an extra year of taxes in there that I had to pay. So not only did I pay the $4,200 in delinquent taxes when I bought it, but there was an extra $1,500 in change in taxes here I had to pay at closing that I had anticipated. So that's something to keep an eye on and make sure you're factoring in. At the end of the day, not a big deal, but kind of stung a little bit. So the process of creating a new mortgage, this is something I talked with Tracy a lot. So I used Russ O'Donnell from calltheunderwriter.com, who Tracy had recommended. So he did the underwriting, basically used the loan application from Fannie Mae, collected some other documentation from the borrower, sent that over to Russ. He did his underwriting, and I got a certificate verifying that it is Dodd-Frank compliant. So it's a fully compliant mortgage and meets all of the ability to pay requirements for the borrower. I used Franco Barilli to prepare the document, so he created the note and mortgage. And then previously, too, he had created the surrender of possession agreement and cancellation of land contract and some other things. So I put a dollar amount here in the slide, but I need to update that because it doesn't actually include all the things that I talked about. And the borrower I had, I'm pretty happy with. So he was buying this as an investment property. So, his plan is to take on this rehab work and then I assume have both units fully rented out. And there's even the potential to turn it into 3 units. There was actually a third set of utilities. And it looked like the unit 1 could potentially be turned into 2 units, but from the photos it wasn't quite clear. But it looks like there's maybe a little bit of upside for him if he could reconfigure this to do it to 3 units. As it is, you can't really do it, but if he did some work, he might be able to. So it was an investment property for him. Guy owned multiple businesses close by in the area, lived in that area. So pretty solid buyer overall. From what I understand, I believe this was his first foray into real estate, but has owned various kinds of other businesses, and I think he'll do all right with it. And from the buyer perspective too, right, when you look at these deals, you always kind of want to look at them from everyone's perspective. Originally, I was thinking, looking at it from the perspective of a buyer who's a house hacker, from the perspective of a buyer who wants to buy this and put some money into it and turn it into a rental. So let's say he does $30K in rehab. Maybe he can do it for less if he has friends in the area who do this kind of thing. So he would have his $5,000 down payment to buy it, and then if he did $30K in rehab, he'd be into it for $35,000, and then he's paying $545 a month out, and that's the P&I, and then there's taxes, insurance on top of that. But if you look at what both units would rent for, and I had some discussions with folks who were saying that, they could fully rehab, they could potentially rent for $800 or $900 each. Even if he rents those both out at $700 a month, he's going to have $1,400 in income. So $545 for the P&I. Even with a lot of other expenses, he's probably going to be doing pretty well on this. Far better than you would be able to do on a rental here in Colorado where I live, or many other places. So I think he got a pretty good deal on this. So the financial picture for me so far, and I just originated this note not that long ago. Haven't seasoned it all the way yet, but if you look at where it stands so far, so bought the note for just about $16,500. I've had about $12,000 in expenses, so that's $4,200 for delinquent taxes, legal fees, servicing, some of the closing costs, and other things. There were still transfer taxes. The borrower paid closing costs, but I still had other expenses related to the sale. And then I had that other tax bill for $1,500 that I had to true up. Into it for about $28,500 so far. If you look at what I got back, so there was the one payment that the borrower made for about $350. I ended up collecting 3 months in rent from the renters. That was $1,650, and then ended up netting around $1,850 at the closing. So there was the $5,000 minus the taxes, minus the water bill, which got trued up there, and some other things. So the total income about $2,300, so right now I'm into the deal total net for about a little over $26,000 overall. So what have I got so far for the $26,000? Well, I've got a performing note that's paying $545 a month. And if you just look at that alone compared to the $26,000 or so that I'm into it for, it's about a 25% yield on the investment. So that's really good. So I could just hold this note and be pretty fat thumb and happy. And the borrower, like I said, is pretty solid, has other assets. I don't expect him to default on this. If he did, there's plenty of room to go through the foreclosure process and even get deficiency judgment or other things if I needed to later on. So it's pretty high yield, around 25%, and a lot of protection and ability to recover if things get sideways. And then that note, right now it's a little smaller now because he started paying on it, but an unpaid balance of around $45,000. So, once you get this note fully seasoned and the market kind of adjusts, right now everybody's kind of in this hunkered down, scared mode. But, especially if you season this note for 12 months or so, I think we're going to be in a different environment then. Should be able to do pretty well. Selling that, there will be an additional profit bump as well. So I'm not going to try to predict the final ROI, but should be a really, really healthy deal overall. So very happy with this one. I thought this was a good one to share just because it had so many crazy twists and turns. I have a feeling there were some other twists and turns I probably even forgot to talk about. Like I said, this was definitely a really interesting borrower overall. I didn't even get into his inability to cash checks and how I had to resend payments and all the wrangling getting him to meet up with the mobile notary and all of those other kinds of things. It was quite time consuming overall, but pretty worthwhile so far. So I hope you found this instructive. I definitely learned a lot just in the process of working this deal. Note deals are fun because it seems like every one I do, there are new things that come up. So hope you enjoyed that. And if you ever have other questions on note investing, ideas for the podcast, other things you want to hear about, or if you just want to chat, you can always feel free to reach out at me. You can get me at dan@fusionnotes.com or go to my website at fusionnotes.com. You can get a lot more information. So that's what I've got for you for now. Take care. See you next time.